All right, in this unit, we turn our attention to postmodernism. Postmodernism is a sprawling intellectual and cultural movement of the second part of the 20th century. Its common themes are that the modern world has ended, or at least it is time for us to recognize that the modern world has reached its end limits, its nadir, and that it's time for us to move on intellectually and culturally. Now, postmodernism is a critical movement, and we will take its point of departure by criticizing, rather, the fundamental institutions of the modern world. And it will take as its initial data the pathologies of the current modern world. So if we survey the modern world from the postmodern perspective, all of the continued problems and crises, the ongoing existence of poverty in the modern world, the ongoing racial and ethnic conflicts domestically and around the world, the international crises and conflict that have been characteristic of the latter part of the modern world, the increasing perhaps environmental degradation. From the postmodern perspective, all of these symptoms are part and parcels and manifestations of modernism's underlying instability, its underlying incoherence, its inability to grapple with the true nature of the human condition, if there is such a thing. And so what we need to do is realize that the revolutionary modern world, or the last couple of centuries, has run its final course, and that all of these crises and pathologies that we see around us are indications of that. And it is so time for us to realize that the modern world has run its course and prepare ourselves for a post-modern world. Now, emphasizing the post prefix here, that we're interested in going beyond the postmodern world or transcending the modern world. Postmodernism is then situating itself in part historically as after the modern world, but it's also situating itself intellectually by rejecting or wanting to go beyond the institutionalizing intellectual principles that animated and gave life to the modern world. So let's start by asking first what the modern world is. And while postmodernism is a sprawling movement intellectually, having movements, sub-movements rather, in philosophy and literature, in the world of arts and architecture, offshoots in the law and history and so forth. And that sprawling movement, it can be hard to wrap one's mind around it intellectually speaking. Nonetheless, the modern world has been with us for several centuries, so we should be able to first figure out what the modern world has been all about, what its core defining features are, and then we can see what the postmoderns are reacting against. So, what is the modern world? Again, modernism is one of those themes that is used variously depending on which academic discipline one is focusing on. I'm going to use modernity in the historian's sense, right, or in the philosopher's sense, to refer to, in effect, the last half millennium. If we go back, say, to 1500s or so, the last 500 years, we can see that the world has transformed itself, at least the Western world particularly, has transformed itself intellectually, culturally, politically, scientifically, and so forth. So that by the time we get to, or rather if we take the last 500 years as a historical unit, we can see that the kind of institutions that exist, the kind of world that people are inhabiting is dramatically different from the world that existed prior to 500 years ago, and we'll call that the pre-modern world. In the modern world, the dominant institutions have been science. We live in a highly scientific culture. Technology has been a defining institution of the modern world. Liberalism, socially and culturally, including democratic republican kinds of political experiments, have been defining institutions of the modern world. And then economically, capitalism and free markets have been the defining institutions. And it's interesting, if you go more than 500 years ago, there's very little science to speak of going on. Of course, there's technology, but nothing on the scale of the technology that's been developed in the modern world. In the pre-modern world, democratic and republican political institutions are almost nowhere, and free market capitalism is almost nowhere, and all of the attendant social institutions, the status of women, relations between the races and different ethnicities and so forth, all of that very different in the modern world compared to the pre-modern world. Okay, now I want now to turn to a table that I've got laid out on the board here and try to put all of that in some philosophical terminology. So what I've got here is three historical eras: the pre-modern era, the modern era, and then we'll get to the postmodern era a little bit. It will define postmodernism against both of these two earlier eras. But if we were to take these two historical labels and track them against these philosophical categories that we've been using over the course of the semester: metaphysics, epistemology, human nature, ethics, politics, and then a historical designation here. What we can do philosophically is see that the pre-modern world, the intellectual foundation of the pre-modern world, is very different from the intellectual foundations of the modern world, and what the postmoderns are going to argue historically and intellectually is that their way of characterizing culture is dramatically different than either the pre-modern or the postmodern. Okay, let's start with the pre-modern world. The pre-modern Western world, which is essentially the European world prior to 1500 or so, the whole medieval era. What was the defining set of intellectual presuppositions that shaped the institutions of the pre-modern world? What was the feudal world like, metaphysically, epistemologically, and so on? Well, metaphysically, we can say that this world was an intensely religious world, and so metaphysically, the dominant assumption is some sort of supernaturalism, that the natural world is a lower world, a less important world, that this world is the world of God, and all of our energies should be focused on coming to know and understand the higher, truer spiritual reality that is represented by God. Epistemologically, the dominant institutions are reliance on mystical experiences as captured in revelations, as captured then in Holy Scriptures, and those then are handed down through the tradition, and everyone in the tradition is expected rather to accept the revealed word of God on faith. And again, there's a bit of a distinction here between those who are more likely to emphasize that we should have faith directly in Scripture versus those who will emphasize that we should have faith in Scripture as interpreted by the authorized tradition, the Catholic Church primarily in this case. Human nature, the primary presupposition here is that human beings are born in sin, that they are beings that are fundamentally dependent for their being and for their continued existence and for their ability to achieve anything positive in the world on a higher power, that higher power primarily being God, or they're dependent on God's institutions, the church, to work through them and with them in order to achieve whatever is necessary. Ethically speaking, people are in the medieval world primarily constrained by duty. Everybody is whatever their station in life, and there are of course a number of classes, and it's a highly hierarchical society here. But depending on one's station in life, one has an attendant set of duties toward other people. Wives have duties with respect to their husbands and the whole family has duties with respect to the feudal lords. The feudal lord has obligations and duties with respect to the king, and the king and everybody in the society have duties with respect to the church and with respect to God. And the assumption here is that individuals will be doing their duties sacrificially. Everybody is willing to serve and to give up and renounce whatever is necessary for the sake of doing their duties. Politically, we characterize the society as a feudal society, but the feudal society is one that is a hierarchical society, characterized by vertical or organization. In the political structure, we have the king at the top, then the aristocrats, and then the guilds, and then the serfs below that. In the religious structure, we have the pope at the top, the cardinals, the bishops, all the way on down to the laity. And so what we have then is a society that is based on a kind of authority or authoritarianism that works in a top-down fashion through the hierarchy. And one's political rights and one's political responsibilities are defined by the hierarchy that one finds oneself in a position of. All right, so this set of philosophical principles here, which we've talked about earlier in the semester, are characteristic of what we call the feudal world, right, broadly speaking, or at least in the Western context, the medieval world. And we can track that in terms of our philosophical label. We can say, broadly speaking, this is the idealist philosophical tradition being institutionalized culturally, and with feudalism then is the result. Now, historians then point out, intellectual historians and philosophical historians, that by the time we get to the 1500s, dramatic sea changes are taking place in Western Europe, and Western Europe is about to transform itself intellectually, and as a result of that, it's going to transform itself culturally, institutionally, politically, economically, and so forth. That what we find at work is I'm first going to go to the epistemological issues here. That there's first a stronger emphasis on the role of reason. We can find the early scientists being much more naturalistic, the philosophers being much more naturalistic in their thinking and using reason to come to understand the natural world. And even within theological circles, as a result of the influence of some of the earlier Greek thinkers through the Thomistic tradition and Thomas Aquinas, the scholastic tradition is using a kind of reason. There's less reliance, rather, even within the religious traditions, on strictly going by mysticism and faith. So what we find is a shift toward reason having more pride of place. And then in stronger forms, we find that reason can and either should work with the senses, or in some more radical cases even be based on the senses. And so we have a much more empirical orientation epistemologically that starts then to emerge. Concurrent with that, we have a rising naturalism, a much greater influence, or rather interest in the natural world, as opposed to the argument that, the traditional argument that the natural world is not particularly worthy of our attention. And this can, of course, come in a variety of forms. We're interested in the natural world because the natural world is God's creation, and so by coming to understand the natural world, we come to understand God. Or we can come to be interested in the natural world in its own right. It's a beautiful place. It's an interesting place. There's all kinds of exciting things to study and to come to know. So we find a rising naturalism and interest in the metaphysical world. There is a concurrent development with respect to human nature, a notion rather that human beings are more likely to be born tabula rasa rather than a traditional notion that we're born in sin. Here there's a rising development of the idea, hearkening back to Aristotle, that human beings are born with a set of capacities that can be developed for good or for evil, but less of an emphasis on the idea that we're born with original sin. And there's an increasing notion here that human beings can, through independent effort, through the thoughts that they create, by the actions that they engage in, achieve some station in life by their own efforts here. We find in concurrent development with this emphasis on natural world, much more of an emphasis on the idea of the pursuit of happiness being a legitimate aim of life. And certainly by the time we get to the 1700s, this language is pretty much everywhere, and it's not accidental then that it becomes an explicit part of the Declaration of Independence, one of the great revolutionary documents of the 18th century and so forth. But the idea that it is legitimate to pursue a certain amount of pleasure in this world, to enjoy one's body, to enjoy various sensuous pleasures, to enjoy the natural world, and that is not necessarily in conflict with one's spiritual development and one's religious pursuits as well, to the extent that one is religious here. And then certainly politically, there are a dramatic series of revolutions here that occur as the modern world goes on, that rather than individuals being subject to various hierarchical authorities, we're starting to emphasize the liberty of individuals to think for themselves on religious matters, to go their own way in their economic pursuits rather than being bound class-wise to a certain station in life, and that when it comes to the laws, that all individuals should be equal under the laws rather than having different laws applying and granting more or fewer privileges to individuals depending on where they are in the hierarchical structure. So politically, the themes of liberty and equality come to dominate in the modern world, and then of course there are revolutions based on those particular principles here. So what we have then is a systematic opposition philosophically between the intellectual themes, right, that come to dominate in the modern world and the intellectual themes that had dominated in the pre-modern world. And in our language, again, we can say that this is, broadly speaking, coming out of the idealist tradition philosophically. This is coming out of the realist tradition philosophically speaking. And so we have a collision historically being played out in the early modern world, and in the early modern world it is the realist tradition that comes to the ascendancy, and it's the one that then starts to reshape the world in what we then come to call the modern way of thinking. Now, I want to change colors here and argue that by the time we get to the mid-process here of the dates here, this is something you can start to see the beginnings of the development in the early Renaissance, and certainly things are well underway by the time we get to the 1500s. The intellectual revolution, right, occurs, and then by the time we get to the 1700s, institutionally, culture starts to change very dramatically, and there are all kinds of revolutions. And there are revolutions because in historical time they happen relatively quickly. They happen in the scientific world, they happen technologically, they happen economically, they happen politically, and then with respect to any number of other social institutions, by the time we get to the 1700s, we have a very revolutionary century right at work here. Now the 1700s is given the label the Enlightenment by most historians and intellectual historians, and whether we date the Enlightenment to the late 1600s and have it spilling over into the 1800s or so, there's of course lots of room for debate and discussion about where exactly one draws the lines, but nonetheless the 18th century or the 1700s is the age of enlightenment. And so what I want to do is develop a flowchart here that takes these themes philosophically and shows how they play out along a timeline, right, historically speaking. And I want to start by just calling this the Enlightenment vision, which is a label that I think is useful here. And I call it a vision in part because it is taking abstract philosophy and taking some cultural development that had occurred in the 1500s and 1600s, but projecting how this will play out to the extent that those themes are institutionalized culturally along a broad set of areas. And I want to start with the emphasis here that we find in the modern world on reason, that epistemological theme. If we go to the early modern world, we find in philosophers like Francis Bacon in England, and then across the channel René Descartes in France, and then in the next generation John Locke again in England, but an increasingly large number of intellectuals. What we find is a strong emphasis on reason. There are various accounts of reason that are being worked out by this generation or two of philosophers, but nonetheless what they all have in common is the idea that human beings are creatures of reason. We have a rational capacity, and the most important thing that we should be doing epistemologically is developing our rational capacity. And there are great battles then between the advocates of reason, so conceived, and those who are advocating faith and tradition. And so all of the early conflicts between philosophers and theologians, or between the early scientists and theologians, that is ongoing in the 1500s and in the early 1600s. But what we find, though, is among the intellectuals that by the time we get significantly into the 1600s, it's the arguments for reason that have prevailed, and reason comes to be, institutionalized rather intellectually. Now, if one at a high level of abstraction does two things, if you take seriously, right, the notion that reason is one's way of coming to understand the natural world, then what becomes almost inevitable is that science is going to be developed as an institution. And so in the 1600s, in the early 1600s, as I mentioned here, we have the development of reason, Francis Bacon, René Descartes. By the time we get to the middle part of the 1600s and on into the 1700s, we can see the foundations of modern science being laid. Galileo in the early part of the 1600s, Isaac Newton in the latter part of the 1600s. With them, astronomy and physics are being put on a fundamentally sound scientific footing, and then all of the various other branches of science start to come to be developed. We can see then by the time we get into the 1700s, chemistry coming online, and then biology, right, becoming online. And so we are then developing a naturalistic understanding of the world through physics and astronomy and chemistry and biology, right, and so forth. Now, if we then take that rational scientific understanding and also include our understanding of ourselves, then what is going to start to happen is a scientific understanding, right, of the human being and its ailments and what makes it work effectively. You will see modern medicine, right, coming into existence. And by the time we get to the 1700s, anatomical studies are coming along, physiological studies are coming along. The science of vaccination with Edward Jenner is coming along. Better understanding of nutrition, right, is coming along. And so we have a scientific understanding of what we would then call modern medicine. One other thing that comes out of the development of modern science is the development of technology. As science progresses and we come to understand the cause and effect relationships in the world, it puts us in a position then to manipulate the cause and effect relationships in the world, to develop new kinds of technologies in order to be able to do various sorts of things. If this is going on in the early 1600s and then picking up steam in the late 1600s and on into the 1700s, and then we see science developing starting in the 1600s and again going on into the 1700s, what makes sense is by the time we get to the middle part of the 1700s, we should expect to see some technological improvements. And we did in the early part of the 1700s see agricultural technology changing dramatically, first in England, but then also increasingly on the continent. And then also engineering technology and industrial technology starts to take off, and the dates of the Industrial Revolution usually are dated from around 1750 or so. But certainly by the time we get to 1770 with James Watt's steam engine and the enormous potential that that unleashes, the Industrial Revolution becomes a potent force by the time we get to the middle and latter part of the 1700s. So reason taken seriously leads to science, science leads to modern medicine, science also leads to modern technology, and these are institutions that then transform the world. To the extent that we have better modern medicine, what starts to happen is people's health improves. And one measure of people's health is that they live longer lives, they live lives that are less painful. To the extent that technology comes along, then the amount of stuff, right, that people have, using that technologically, terminological term stuff here, the Industrial Revolution transforms, right, the human productive capacity. Agricultural yields go up dramatically, factory yields go up dramatically, and so people start to have increasing amounts of stuff. And of course, the more stuff there is, the price of that stuff goes down, so a broader number of people are able to enjoy that stuff. All right, and we can certainly see these trends. Human life expectancy numbers start to change in the 1700s and increase as the 1800s go on, and then dramatically in the 20th century, and the same thing occurs. The amount of material goods, the quantity of them, the quality of them improving as the 1800s and then the 1900s go on. Okay, now suppose we backtrack and we go back to reason. So far we've been focusing more on the epistemological implications of taking reason seriously toward the study of the natural world, including the study of the human being as a natural world. What happens if we take an epistemological emphasis on reason and apply it to ethical issues and value issues and political issues as well? Well, one of the things that starts to happen significantly as this emphasis, this new emphasis on reason emerges is, in the early modern world, an emphasis on individualism. The notion here in the pre-modern world, to the extent that we are expected to act on faith, this notion that we are dependent, all of that was part and parcel of the feudal world's class system, that you are dependent upon the larger community, you are dependent upon God, you are dependent upon knowing your place and doing what you are told, and you are expected to act on faith and just accept your lot in life. To the extent, however, that we emphasize reason, well, every individual, right, has his or her own rational capacity, and if that is a legitimate capacity, if it's a competent capacity, then what we should see is a rising respect for and emphasis on respecting the individual's own rational judgment as the source of decisions about what should go on in people's lives. And so what we do start to find then as a result of this is an increasing emphasis on liberalism in various aspects of human life. For example, religious liberalism, the idea that rather than my being expected to simply accept a certain religious tradition because I happen to be born into it, rather than my being expected to accept other people's say-so about what is true on religious grounds, what we find is a rising emphasis that I should be free on religious matters to think for myself about what's true, to come up with my own interpretation of what is true, and if I disagree with other people, to be free to go my own way on religious matters, to start my own church, to worship in my own particular way. If it's a matter of individualism, rational individuals applied to my own to my political life, right? The idea of what I should be able to do should not simply be a matter of my being born into a certain station in life and other people having political authority to tell me what I should be doing. Rather, if there are political institutions that are having an effect on my life, I should be free to participate in those political institutions and to have some say in how those political institutions are shaped in various ways. So the development of reason, right, in the 1600s, by the time we get to the 1700s, individualism is being taken seriously, and so it's not, I don't think, accidental, but by the time we get seriously into the 1700s, we have a number of political revolutions. So we think by the time we get to the latter part of the 1700s, there's the liberal revolution in the United States, or the bringing into existence of the United States, a kind of democratic republicanism that it involves a revolution against the remnants of a feudal system across the ocean in England under King George. And of course, the American revolutionaries are arguing that we should not be having a feudal monarchical system. We should have a kind of liberal system, a democratic republic, and Americans should not be second-class citizens relative to the English, and so forth. And a few years later in France, again, another revolution in the name of the principles of equality and liberty against the traditional hierarchical system, against the French feudal system with King Louis and Marie Antoinette, and a very powerful still Catholic church. And so we get, in that case, a much bloodier revolution that ultimately was not too successful, but at least in principle, we are getting rid of the older feudal system and reinstituting a modern system based on principles of liberty and equality. So as a result of that, what we should find in the modern world is that individuals have an increasing amount of freedom, and as it then is played out in the 1800s, we find that the new equality and the new liberties that are first extended to males. There are then the development of anti-slavery societies in the late 1700s, and then by the time we get into the 1800s, slavery is gradually eliminated from England, from France, from America, and their possessions right around the world. By the time we get to the late 1700s, we see women also arguing that the same principles that apply to men should obviously apply to women. Women are also rational individuals who can think for themselves and so should have some political say. And so we find various kinds of early feminist movements taking off in the 1800s. arguing for the same freedoms. Women should be able to own property in their own name, eventually to vote, to go to school, to choose their careers, to choose their marital partners, as opposed to simply being part of a collective family in their the hierarchy in the family. That is to say, primarily the father makes the decision about whom they marry and so forth. So increasing amounts of freedom as the 18th century ends and on into the 19th century. Now, also, if we take individualism seriously, we can certainly talk about the political institutions here, but if we take individualism seriously, that's going to have economic institutions or economic implications, for example, and what we also find is a dramatic increase in capitalist institutions, free market institutions. We have a breakdown of the feudal economic structure that again had been around for a great deal of time. Rather than only the king being allowed to own property and perhaps a few nobles being able to own property, perhaps maybe a few freeholders here and there, property rights are extended to everybody. Everybody in principle can own property rights. Rather than the career path that one follows being dictated by one's place in a class structure. If you're born a woman, then here's what your career path is going to be. If you're born the son of the duke, well, here's what your career path is going to be. If your father is a tinsmith or a haberdasher, right, or a cooper, here's what your career path is going to be. It's all set out and so forth. Instead, what we have is individuals being free to make their own individual rational choices about what they want to do with their lives and so forth. So we have liberty rights in the economic sphere, we have property rights in the economic sphere, and people are increasingly seen as free agents, free individuals, free to enter into whatever sorts of contractual arrangements they want with other people as well. And so by the time we get to the late 1700s, we find capitalistic free market institutions coming to dominate the world. And just as in 1776, the American Revolution was primarily a political revolution, certainly had a number of economic implications as well, but also in 1776, the first kind of modern treatise on capitalist free market institutions, Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, is published. 1776 then is a banner year here. And then the implication of that is that capitalist institutions are much more productive if you have people choosing their own careers and you have contract and property rights and so forth. We should have societies that are much wealthier than traditional feudal societies. And so what we have then, and why I'm calling this as an enlightened envisionment, if we think of the intellectuals of the 1700s who are noticing the trend toward political liberalism, the trend toward economic capitalism, the Industrial Revolution, the various revolutions in medicine and science more broadly speaking, that all of these revolutionary things are coming into place, and we can trace that back to some philosophical revolutions that had occurred in the 1600s. That vision allows us then to project out what's going to happen over the course of the next century or so, and any number of predictors, right, among the 18th century intellectuals will argue very optimistically that human beings, their future, right, is going to be a future of progress, right, that we have finally figured out a set of philosophical principles that when institutionalized will make people free, and that freedom will be more progressive. People will be wealthier. People will have more material goods. Poverty will not be a natural and inescapable amount of life. People will live longer, and they will live more healthily and relatively more pain-free. That progress is the natural birthright of humankind. There is not a human problem that can't be solved with the application of reason and all of reason's institutions. And so we can think progressively. We can think in terms of the pursuit of happiness being the natural birthright. We can think of freedom, health, and ultimately wisdom and so forth as the natural lot of man. All right, now this is the Enlightenment vision, as I'm calling it, and it is a way of developing in flowchart form how this set of modern philosophical themes is expected to develop historically. This is a kind of an abstract, timeless table characterizing some abstract themes here. If we operationalize it politically, economically, and in terms of scientific and technological institutions, if we operationalize it and make it an actual working part of the machinery of culture, the argument is that this is what is going to play out. And so we have a very optimistic, a very good news story about the modern world. Now, what does all of this have to do with postmodernism? All right, well, what all of this has to do with postmodernism is that the postmoderns will argue that this entire vision is excrement. It's all wrong. It is a fraud. It is a self-congratulatory, patting oneself on the back story that the modernists will tell. And certainly the modernists were revolutionary with respect to the pre-moderns, but from the postmodern perspective, this whole story has been revealed to be a fraud by the time the modern world has been in a position to develop for a couple of centuries. What the postmoderns will argue is that every single cell on this vision flowchart here has been revealed to be a fraud, and that the pathological elements of it have dominated. Suppose we take, for example, the liberal element here. The modern world will pride itself on its commitment to freedom for individuals, commitment to extending the franchise, to gradually eliminating various barriers here. But what the postmoderns will argue is that this is not true if you look at pretty much anybody who is not a white male Anglo-Saxon and so forth. So what they will argue is that the promise of freedom that the Marxists, that the modernists make is a fraud, and what we find is that we are still in a society that is dominated by sexism, by males dominating females, by whites as a group dominating non-whites as a group, by those who have various kinds of ethnic backgrounds dominating all other ethnicities, and so forth. So what we have instead is a society that is riven with sexism, racism, and so forth. Okay. The claim of capitalism, that is going to generate huge amounts of wealth, and that property rights are going to be extended more broadly, and economic liberty rights are going to be extended more broadly. That too, from its perspective, has been revealed to be a fraud. Certainly there's been a great deal of wealth that has been generated here, but what the postmoderns will argue is that essentially the Marxist analysis is right on this score here, that what we have is an economic system that is characterized by a smaller group of people at the top, rich people who have succeeded in co-opting control of most of society's wealth, and they are using it to advantage themselves at the expense of everyone else in society. That the technology that is promised, that the modernists will tell us the good news story about all of these technologies that we have, the cars, the airplanes, and so forth, the personal entertainment devices and so on. But the argument here is that all of this technology is in fact damaging human relationships with each other, because what we have is, for example, the development of nuclear weapons. And these are nuclear weapons and various other kinds of high-tech military devices that are products of the modern world, and ultimately what that's going to mean is human beings are simply going to be able to exterminate large numbers of other human beings, and that these nuclear weapons are going to be tools that the rich people use, that those who are in positions of cultural dominance to keep the other people in threat. That this technology that we're developing, our ability to drive our own cars, to have central heating, to be able to fly anywhere we want around the world, is ultimately destroying the environment, and so that the modern world is self-destroying the world, but nonetheless talking up a pretty story about environmental beautification and pretending to be green and so forth. That if we look on the scientific institutions here that the modern world prides itself on, The argument that many postmodernists will make is that scientific ways of thinking about the world, this emphasis on reason, on experiment, on analysis, on being able to do mathematics and so forth, that way of thinking about the world is just one way of thinking about the world that perhaps some white males are proficient at, but this is not necessarily the only way of thinking about the world, and what the moderns are doing is being intellectually imperialistic, if we can use that language, in making the argument that everybody should bow down before science, and that those who are the scientists and have the scientific knowledge, those are the ones that we should be putting up on pedestals, and that the claims of the scientists are being allowed to eclipse various other ways of human beings trying to come to know the world and themselves. This individualism, the moderns will prize, they will argue, is a mask for what really is an ongoing group conflict, that human beings are not really individuals. Instead, we are defined by our cultural identities, we're defined by our economic background, we're defined by our sexual gender roles, we're defined by our racial groups, we're defined by the various kinds of technological environment we find ourselves involved in, and that human beings really are group creatures constructed by the group membership that they have, and all of this rhetoric about being our own individuals and thinking for ourselves, that is a fraud used to mask various kinds of group conflict. And then the fundamental point here, the postmoderns will argue that this emphasis on reason, on the competence of reason, on our ability objectively to come to know the world, that all of that has been revealed to be a fraud, and that instead there's the truth of the world, if I can use that language, is a kind of skepticism about the claims of reason. That reason comes up with various kinds of stories that it can tell of course, but stories are really just stories. All we have really are a bunch of narratives, and these narratives are subjective creations, in many cases group subjective creations. There's no one of them that we can ever figure out to be the true account of the way the world really is. So the argument then is going to be that everything that I've got in black is a better description of the way the world actually works. All of those things are the exact opposite of everything in the green. That is the self-congratulatory story that the modernists want us to believe about the world. But the truth is, if we can use language of truth in the context of postmodernism, that everything in the green, this self-congratulatory story, doesn't actually end up in this happy story about the pursuit of happiness and progress. Instead, the truth about the world really is a kind of cynical truth, that the world is really governed by power, that it's governed by conflict, and that rather than a happy ever after kind of story possible for us here on the world, instead the world is going to be one of ongoing zero-sum, win versus lose, this group versus that group, struggle, powers for struggle, and so on. All right, next I want to turn then to the table and go back and, abstracting from this flowchart philosophical play out here, put it in more philosophical language here, so we can see then a principled contrast between the postmodern philosophical themes and the themes that animate and then become institutionalized in these two systems here. All right. If we are postmoderns, the postmoderns are going to argue that the claims of reason have been shown by the time we get to 20th century philosophy to be fatally flawed, just as the claims of mysticism and faith in the earlier generations were shown to be fatally flawed as well. And what we will find is, in postmodernism, a skepticism about both the claims of mysticism and the claims of reason, and that then will play out as a thoroughgoing skepticism, and then the idea will be to use the usual approved postmodern language here, that all we have are narratives. We have any number of competing narratives, And we all, of course, believe that our particular narrative is the right narrative, but there is no way to step outside of any of the stories that we have come to believe and judge them objectively against each other or against any sort of independent world. There is no meta stance that we can take. There is no one true meta narrative that we can ever come up with, so all we're left with is a bunch of relative, group-defined, competing narratives and so forth. Now, this then applies metaphysically. The label I'm going to put in here is anti-realism. The postmoderns will argue, well, if we're skeptical rather about all narratives, well, that is going to include any metaphysical narratives. And of course, one of the great battles historically has been between those who believe in the existence of God and those who are naturalistic, right, those who are not. But both of them are making the claim that there is a true account metaphysically of the world that can be given. And they just simply disagree over whether the reality, however it's conceived, ultimately just is the natural world or it's the natural world plus a supernatural world. As skeptics, the postmoderns are going to argue that there is no such thing as a true account of reality. Right? That is to say, we are anti-realistic. We don't think an account of reality can be given, and it's not that we think that this one is definitely false, or this one is definitely false, or this is definitely true, or definitely true. It's just meaningless to try to address and come up with a real account of the way the world works. The argument that the postmodernists will make with respect to human nature is that human beings are conceived by the pre-moderns as individuals who are born in sin. Certainly there are collectivistic elements, that you know, the original sin, for example, in most traditional accounts is a collective guilt that all humans bear independent of their particular individual things that they may have not yet done. Even infants, for example, are born in sin. But nonetheless, this sin is seen as something that inheres in individuals, and individuals, their primary responsibility is to realize their dependence on God and to form the right kind of relationship with God. So there's a kind of individualism that is built into this as well. Certainly by the time we get to the modern world, we see individuals as independent, tabula rasa creatures with a set of capacities that they can develop for good or for evil. What we will find strongly developed in postmodernism is the notion that human beings are fundamentally members of groups. They're members of racial groups, they're members of gender groups, they are members of ethnic groups, they're members of economic groups, and that these groups memberships define, right, who one is, and so we have what I'm going to call a group, right, determinism. The postmodernism are, for the most part, environmental determinists, but they're environmental determinists of a collectivist variety. That it's kind of an overlapping set of racial, sexual, ethnic, and so forth groups that one finds oneself formed by, and that one's group membership then defines what one comes to believe. When it comes to the ethics in postmodernism, what we find here is a strong emphasis on the idea of their world being driven by conflict, that it is a world of oppression, of stronger groups being able to beat up and take advantage of the weaker groups, and that what we should do is have compassion for those groups that have been typically and traditionally on the losing end of these various conflicts. So a great deal of empathy, right, or pity or compassion or identification with those groups that have been on the losing end of various kinds of conflicts here. In this case here, we can see the politics. We have, broadly speaking, a capitalist or free market democratic republic orientation that's come out of the modern world, the feudal notion over here. What we will find in postmodernism is a strong emphasis either on egalitarianism as an ideal, right, against which we should measure social progress. The egalitarianism coming from the French word for equality being égalité, It's not that the world is actually characterized by egalitarianism or any equality. Instead, what we do have is unequal groups in conflict with each other, but that nonetheless this should be a kind of regulative ideal guiding our thinking. We should be striving for achieving some sort of equal group membership, and then more pregnantly against the feudalism that is characteristic of the modern world and the capitalism that is characteristic of the modern world. I think I said, I should have said pre-modern here, modern here. We find that all of the major postmodernists are, or were significantly during their careers, advocates of a socialist political and economic kind of institution. I'd like to make some connections of postmodernism to some of the earlier intellectual movements that we've looked at this semester in this course here. The postmoderns are a latter part of the 20th century intellectual movement, and certainly their influence in educational circles started to be felt by the time we got to the latter part of the 20th century. But it's also true to say that the postmoderns were well aware of the earlier philosophical traditions, the earlier educational traditions, and while they disagree radically and fundamentally with many or most of them, they are nonetheless also drawing on certain of those earlier traditions as well. So I want to make a few connections here. If we go to the epistemology, for example, one of the interesting things is that many of the postmoderns will describe themselves as neo-pragmatists. For example, Richard Rorty, an American postmodernist, would describe his thinking as strongly influenced by John Dewey and his pragmatism. There's a school of law called legal pragmatism that is kind of the postmodern wing of legal scholarship. And what is being drawn on is the pragmatic skepticism, and it's a radicalized skepticism that we first find in the modern world in pragmatic thinkers like John Dewey, William James, and others. At that point, there was a certain skepticism about what the pragmatists saw as the overreaching claims of the power of reason that the realist and early modern thinkers had developed here. And so the pragmatists, in more moderate form, were arguing for kind of a more chastened version of reason, so they're still relying on reason to whatever extent that it's capable of doing so. What we find, though, with the postmoderns is that they will take the skeptical arguments that the pragmatists will make and really run with them at reaching to the point that the conclusion, rather, that there is no such thing as truth that is possible. Instead, all we have are a bunch of stories that more or less seem to work, but different groups have different stories, and that's just our predicament. So there is a connection between pragmatism epistemologically and postmodernism. If we take issues of human nature, I've emphasized here the notion of determinism, that environmental determinism is a dominant understanding of how human beings come into existence. In our discussions, we've talked about behaviorism being a school of thought emphasizing the plasticity of human nature, and that if you take a human being and put it into pretty much any sort of environment that one wants, one can construct the kind of human being that one wants. What we'll find in the postmoderns is the postmoderns, in part because of the influence of behaviorists, but also in part because of the influence of Marxism. Marxism also emphasizes environmental determinism. The postmodernists are strongly advocating that as well. And in this case here, rather than it simply being the individual, right, who is the operative unit that is being operated on, the postmodernists are more likely to cast it in a group direction. The emphasis on conflict and oppression, right, that the idea of human beings, their relations not being characterized by benevolence, win-win trade, friendship, right, and so forth. A deep sense that the human condition is fundamentally flawed, that we're reaching a world that is in crisis, that we don't know what to do, that there is no God to tell us the right answer. Science can't be turned to for a right set of answers, but nonetheless we have to make choices and so forth. All of those themes and that emotional universe of darkness, conflict, and oppression being front and central to us. All of that as characteristic of postmodernism means that the postmodernists do have a strong connection to many of the existentialists. Many of the postmodern thinkers are French intellectuals, and they are the French intellectuals of the next generation after the first generation of existentialists such as Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus. And while they will disagree with some of the existentialist themes, they nonetheless will characteristically adopt and stick with that emotional center of gravity that is existentialism. So there are strong connections then between the postmoderns and existentialism. When we turn to politics, and this is a story I'm going to be developing at greater length here, postmodernism is a highly politicized movement, and as important as the epistemological issues are, it is arguable but that for the postmoderns, politics really is the part of philosophy that's the central motor for the movement. The tradition of Marxism emphasizing a certain kind of socialism, emphasizing that we should be strictly egalitarian, emphasizing the group determinism, emphasizing the conflict between stronger and weaker. That whole way of characterizing human political dynamic, human economic dynamic, and then holding up as a regulative ideal some kind of egalitarian socialist notion. The postmodernists do draw strongly on that Marxist tradition, and so it's fair to characterize the postmodernists as, at least in that area, neo-Marxist. So one thing as a way of characterizing postmodernism's connections to earlier intellectual movements is to say that they are a hybrid movement, that what they're doing is that they're taking things from pragmatism and radicalizing them, doing the same for behaviorism, doing the same for existentialism, doing the same for Marxism, and then if we go up to the metaphysics, that what they are doing is mounting a very radical critique of both the idealist tradition that dominated in the pre-modern world and the realist tradition that dominated in the modern world, that they are then both anti-idealist and anti-realist. Okay. And then with idealism, realism, pragmatism, behaviorism, existentialism, and Marxism, we have all of the other movements, or most of all of the other movements that we have spent time on this semester. Postmodernism seeing itself as reacting fundamentally against certain of them, but incorporating certain grains of truth, or at least grains of appropriateness from certain of the others. All right, what I want to turn next to is some quotations from postmodern thinkers in their own words that emphasize various of these themes here. All right, and I'd like to read to you some quotations from leading postmodernists of the late 20th century and make some connections between those quotations and some of the themes I've been putting up here in abstract form. First one from Michel Foucault, French postmodern thinker, quotation: "It is meaningless to speak in the name of or against reason, truth, or knowledge." All right, so here the key theme Foucault is attacking is the notion of reason. What he's saying is that it's meaningless to speak on behalf of reason, but it's also meaningless to speak against reason. Right? We are so skeptical that the issue of reason status and so forth is just not even on the cards. But along with reason, Foucault mentions truth or knowledge. Right? Truth is a meaningless concept. Knowledge, right, is a meaningless concept. And the idea has been that prior to a radical kind of skepticism, truth meant something. In some sense, there's a connection between what goes on in our heads and the way the world actually is. Or to speak of knowledge, this is to say that we have a certain cognitive orientation to the way the world is, but the radical skepticism that Foucault is embracing here, that is characteristic of the postmoderns, indicates that that is just completely pointless. So that is entirely out. Next quotation I'd like to read is from Stanley Fish, an American postmodernist. Quote, sorry, not quote, deconstruction, just introducing the label here. Fish was primarily a literature professor, and deconstruction is a literary method that the postmodernists developed for analyzing and breaking down texts, is what Fish is saying about deconstruction as a literary method here. Deconstruction, quote, relieves me of the obligation to be right and demands only that I be interesting. Now again, we have an epistemological theme here. What we're saying is there is no such thing as right if deconstruction is true, or if the postmodern critique of traditional epistemology is true. There is no such thing as right and wrong. And so what we're not trying to do when we're interpreting pieces of text is figure out what's the right interpretation or what's the true interpretation. It's just a story, right? We're just talking here about narratives. And when we're talking about stories that have been made up or narratives that have been made up, we're not asking is, are these true? Because we know that they're stories that are just made up. Instead, what we're looking for from narratives, what we're looking for from stories is that they engage us, that we find them interesting. The person can tell a good story, an interesting story. And so what Fish then is arguing is that postmodernism is not then about what's right, but rather about what's an interesting narrative and what's a different narrative. And instead of objective criteria, what's interesting and so forth is more subjective, it's more non-objective. And so we're just interested in subjective play, right, more primarily here. All right, now, other postmodernists, though, will take things in a darker direction. And my next quotation, actually I have two quotations here from Andrea Dworkin. Andrea Dworkin and her colleague in law made an argument against censorship on postmodern grounds, or sorry, in favor of censorship of certain kinds of pornography, rather, on postmodern grounds, arguing that pornography is a certain kind of narrative, it's a certain kind of story, but it's a story that portrays conflict, or that it portrays males in a dominant role and females in a submissive role. And as a result of the prevalence of pornography, males and females are constructed to have certain kinds of gender roles that are detrimental to females and serve to prop up the male-dominated patriarchal society that postmoderns think we have. And so censorship of pornography was a legitimate pose here. But what I want to focus on in these two quotations is Dworkin's claims about the nature of relationships between males and females. But because the language is very strong here and I'm a delicate-souled person, I won't actually read them out. We'll just have them flashed on the screen here. All right, now notice what Dworkin is doing here is defining individuals by their group membership, right, in the first place. You are a male or you are a female, and arguing that the relationship between those two groups is one of conflict, right, and oppression, right? Males and females, contrary to the modern claim that it's all about women's empowerment and women's liberty and that we're making progress toward women's equality. The argument here is that that is just a good news story. It's a cover story that masks the real brutal truth of the matter, which is still that males are primed and conditioned to dominate women, and women, the contemporary narratives, including all of the pornographic narratives, are trying to reinforce that narrative and prop up the continued oppression of women by males here. All right, next quotation from Jean-François Lyotard, a French postmodernist. He is the one who, in a book called The Postmodern Condition, came up with the label that came to be widely associated with the postmodern movement. He is also the one who came up with the emphasis on narratives and the theme of being incredulous toward any meta-narrative is a formulation that comes from Lyotard here. But also in focusing on this issue of group membership being primary, conflict and oppression being dominant, take this quotation here. from the early 1990s. Quote, Saddam Hussein, the former dictator of Iraq, is a product of Western departments of state and big companies, just as Hitler, Mussolini, and Franco were born of the peace imposed on their countries by the victors in the Great War. Saddam is such a product in an even more flagrant and cynical way, because the Iraqi dictatorship proceeds, as do the others, from the transfer of problems in the capitalist system to the vanquished, less developed, or simply less resistant countries. All right, so now we have a number of themes here. What we have is this theme of, on the political grounds, capitalism is a system that says it's in favor of liberty and equality, and the capitalist can tell a good news story about that. But what is really going on is the traditional Marxist story of there being oppression, there being exploitation, but what the capitalist countries have been able to do is take all of their conflict and exploitation, all the problems that develop from that, and export them, right, to third world countries, to weaker countries such as Iraq. And so capitalism's pathologies are masked or hidden or swept under the international carpet, so to speak, and it is then the third world countries that are bearing the brunt of this. So what we then have is rich countries versus poor countries, or strong countries versus weaker countries here. It's those groups in conflict on an international scale. So it's not simply males and females or members of different races. It's different ethnic groups, different economic groups on a worldwide scale. But also notice what he says about Saddam Hussein, that particular dictatorship. His situation is a constructed, right, situation. It's not that he made certain choices and the Iraqis made certain choices. Rather, they are puppets being controlled by Western governments, by Western big companies, and so their situation is something that is imposed on them. They are determined, they are constructed by the international political and economic environment that they find themselves in. All right, Michel Foucault, to go back to him in this next quotation here, what he will argue in this quotation is that there is nonetheless a place where we can see the true nature of Western society in a non-pretend kind of form, and that place is prison. Quote, prison is the only place where power is manifested in its naked state, in its most excessive form, and where it is justified, right, as moral force. What is fascinating about prisons is that for once, power doesn't hide or mask itself. It reveals itself as tyranny pursued into the tiniest details. It is cynical and at the same time pure and entirely justified, because its practice can be totally formulated within the framework of morality. So what Foucault is arguing here is that if we look at prison, we can see prison as a microcosm of our society, right, writ large. And what, of course, you find in prison is you have the strong, the prison guards, and you have the weak. You have those who are the ones holding the weapons, and those are the ones who are behind bars. Those who have all of the power, and those who are forced to follow. And that social dynamic that gets played out in prison of one group, right, versus another group, conflict and oppression, and then simply a dominance, right, of that one group brutally over every aspect of the other group's lives. That is what prison life is all about, and that's what our society is all about. But then at the same time, Foucault points out that even though prison is a brutal place, and the kinds of people who are attracted to prison work are the kinds of people who like being in that kind of environment, like having that power to be able to make other people do what they want to do and to see people chronically and consistently behind bars. That's the kind of person who is attracted to work in prison. There's nonetheless a happy, good news story that the prison system tells. The prison system is all about justice, right? It's all about keeping society safe. And so we empower these brutal individuals and give them all of the power to do whatever they want, to the prisoners, but at the same time, we give them a story that justifies to them and to everybody else their ability to exert power over other people. So the argument is going to be then, if we apply that to Western capitalist society, that from the postmodern perspective, that society is an exploitative system, a brutal system of rich taking advantage of the weak, of males taking advantage of women, of whites taking advantage of all of the other races and so forth. But the capitalists at the same time are telling themselves and telling everybody, yes, but it's all about freedom, it's all about equality, it's all about justice and so forth. We're not oppressing anybody, and so on. So we have a cover story that justifies, from the postmodern perspective, the brutality of the system. Next, I want to move on to Jacques Derrida, another French postmodernist. Again, speaking about deconstruction as Stanley Fish had spoken about deconstruction. But what's interesting here is that Derrida will make a connection from deconstruction as an epistemological method applied to narratives to a certain kind of politics. Quote, "Deconstruction never had meaning or interest, at least in my eyes, than as a radicalization. That is to say, also within the tradition of a certain Marxism, in a certain spirit of Marxism." So what Derrida is saying is that from his perspective, primarily it was politics that is the important theme here. A kind of Marxist socialism or a Marxist egalitarian ethic animating that socialism. That was the thing that got him interested in postmodernism and postmodernism's literary methods, deconstruction, which are the radical skepticism about there being such things as true narratives and our skepticism toward meta-narratives and so forth, that it is politics that is driving a certain epistemological approach for certain kind of strategic reasons. And of course, if we ask what is central to Marxism, what is central to Marxism is a group analysis, an environmental determinism, and an analysis of contemporary society that it is marked by conflict and oppression and exploitation. So for Foucault, all of this then is bundled in a package with a certain political agenda. Now, what does this have to do with education? Well, of course, that will be the main focus of our next unit here, but I do want to give you one more quotation from a literature professor who was a colleague of Stanley Fish's, Frank Lentricchia, who made the following observation in a book called Criticism and Social Change, where he speaks about postmodernism, its political agenda, and what this implies for the job of a postmodern teacher or a postmodern professor. What is the whole point here? Quote, "Postmodernism seeks not to find the foundation and the conditions of truth, but to exercise power for the purpose of social change." All right, we'll pause right there for a moment here. All right, truth is out. We're not seeking truth. The job of a professor, the job of a teacher is not to seek truth, right? That's the old story that they're God's truth or the scientific truth. Truth is out. Instead, we're interested in power. The postmodern argument is that really is a power struggle. That's all that is true of our social condition. And so our job then is to ourselves get power and to use this power for the purpose of social change. That then is to say, politics, for a certain kind of politics necessarily here. And then carrying on the quotation, one's task as a professor is to help students spot, confront, and work against the political horrors of one's time. That then is to say, your primary job as a teacher, your primary job as a professor is to be critical of the existing system, to help students to realize that they live in a horrible system. They live in a pathological system. They live in a system that is marked by power struggles, that the weak are constantly being oppressed, exploited, and taken advantage of by various strong groups, that your job is to make students aware of this and to then cultivate in them, right, the kind of compassion and identification with those oppressed and exploited groups that will make them into the kinds of people who will make the revolutionary efforts necessary to overcome modern society and all of its institutional structures and to bring forth a postmodern society. All right, in this next subunit, I want to focus on postmodernism's connections to Marxism. Postmodernism is, among all of the movements that we were looking at this semester, the most politicized of the movements, and it puts politics right front and center in a way that other philosophical systems of education do not. My takeoff point will be for two of the quotations I read at the last of the end of the last subunit, one from Franklin Tricchia, arguing that the task of a professor, right, is to help the student focus on particular horrors of his or her times, that is to say, to be critical of existing society, and that the job of the professor is not so much to focus on issues of truth, but rather to exercise power in order to bring about social change. Now, what are the horrors of the current time, or from what perspective do we see the current society as being horrible? And if we're interested rather in exercising power rather than truth, we're setting aside truth issues, we're focusing merely on power. Why are we setting aside power? How do we want to exercise power? And if we're talking about social change, what kind of social change do we want to bring out? What we have then is the professor as a kind of political activist in the classroom, and that's going to transform the nature of education, obviously. The other quotation I wanted to touch base with once again is the one from Jacques Derrida, arguing as a postmodernism, one of the things that motivated him to do all of the epistemological work and the linguistic work and the deconstructive methods that he applied to literary texts and so forth, his statement that that was of interest to him coming out of the tradition of Marxism, as he put it, in a certain spirit of Marxism. So what is this spirit of Marxism that is motivating Derrida, and in what way is it just going to be a spirit of Marxism, not necessarily the actual historical Marxism, or at least Marxism with some variations that the postmodernist educators are going to want to put in practice. So for that, I want to do a little thumbnail history of Marxism, because while postmodernism does have things to say about human nature and ethics and values and epistemology, and it's anti-metaphysical in some ways, the political theme, particularly the history of Marxist political thought in both theory and practice in the century leading up to postmodernism, is an important part of the story. So I have on the board here a timeline. If we go back to 1850, we'll start the story somewhere around there, and then we'll bring the story up to the early noughts here in the early part of the 21st century, where we are now. Now, 1850, not too arbitrary. We can single out a date 2 years earlier, 1848. This is the year that Marx and Engels jointly publish the Communist Manifesto. And this then is, as a manifesto should be, kind of a rallying cry for certain segments of the left, particularly the far left, to mount a revolution, or work toward a revolution, right, in the name of a species of socialism, the communist species of socialism. Now, Marx also worked out any number of more economic treatises and political treatises, and did kind of quasi-sociological work, and was very engaged with ongoing current events and interpreting them in the light of his system and so forth. And in his position, writing primarily from England, being a transplanted German, England then being the heart of advanced industrial capitalism, Marx sees England as a laboratory in which history is being played out. And so he is in a position then as a social scientist and as a politically and economically engaged social scientist to make certain predictions about how capitalism is going to play out. Now, the argument that the Marxists then are making is that capitalism is, of course, an evil system. It's an exploitative system. It's a zero-sum system. But if you characterize the system that way, then there are certain predictions, right, that one can make about the logic of capitalism, how it is going to play out. And so farther over to the left here on the board, I have a miniaturized table. What we have then is the bourgeoisie in economic competition with the proletariat. That is to say, those who own property and those who work for those who have property. And in this case here, the bourgeoisie are going to be those who are rich, because they own all of the property, and the logic is that the proletariat are going to be the poorer members of the class. They have to sell their wages for subsistence labor. And then, of course, in capitalism, there is a nascent middle class that comes into existence, but Marxism has a logical prediction for how that is going to play out. Now, if we have then a rich class and a poor class engaged in zero-sum competition from each other, the Marxist analysis then argues that out of competition you have winners and you have losers. Those who lose in various forms of economic competition, they then get forced into the middle class. Those who win the economic competition, they then are in a position to become rich and powerful. And the Marxist argument is as successive rounds of competition carry on, what should happen is increasing numbers of people are forced into poverty, and then smaller numbers of people emerge in this zero-sum competition as being at the top of the heap and so forth. The rich and the poor are engaged in economic competition with each other, but also within the class of the bourgeoisie, those who own property, they are engaged in economic competition with each other. Some of those lose in the competition, they're forced down to the middle class or even into the class of the poor, and those who are more ruthlessly successful in that economic competition, they amass greater and greater amounts of economic wealth and power. And so what we should find then is a small group of very wealthy people at the top of the economic heap, and then a large group of very poor people at the bottom, right, of the economic heap, so to speak. Now, about the middle class from the Marxist perspective is an unstable class. It's brought about by capitalism. Capitalism does generate some goods, but what we have is, of course, the zero-sum competition applies to members of the middle class. Once one loses one's property and is forced into the poor class. Some small number of the middle class will succeed in clawing their way up into the rich class, but nonetheless what we should find then over time is the zero-sum competition forces people either up into the rich class or into the poor class, and so we should have a declining middle class. So what we then have is a Marxist analysis of capitalist society that leads to then three fairly definite predictions here, and these are the predictions that are worked out by the middle part of the 19th century in Marxism. So part of what the Marxists then are doing, as well as engaging in political activism and so forth, is waiting for the logic of capitalism inexorably to work its way out in this particular form. And then their hope is that once you have a very small number of people in the rich class and a large number of people in the poor class, these poor people have become increasingly desperate, they develop a class consciousness, they will rise up in revolution and overthrow the rich class. Now the problem was that by the time we go across a couple of generations here, it's getting now to the 1870s, the 1880s, the 1890s, and 1900s and so forth, it doesn't seem to be that the poor are becoming revolutionary. There are obviously there's historically some unrest here and there are clashes here and there, but we don't find the great class consciousness developing, and we don't find the mass revolutionary movements going on. And that is, of course, very unsettling from the classic Marxist perspective. But also, if we are attending to the numbers, we're crunching the numbers, we're generating the statistics and so forth, as we should be doing as good social scientists, by the time we get to the 1900s and on well into the 1900s, even with things like the First World War, the Great Depression, the recovery from the Great Depression, what we find, though, is that the actual results of the development of capitalism don't seem to be going in the direction that Marx predicted. Instead of an increasing number of poor people being characteristic in the population of the capitalistic society, what seems to be happening is the numbers of people who are living in poverty is smaller. Right? People are acquiring bigger houses, they're acquiring access to entertainment, they're acquiring more modes of transportation, their clothes are better, they're living longer, right, and so forth. This is not necessary to say that by the 1900s the problem of poverty has been solved, but poverty by the time we get to the 1900s is not as bad as poverty in the 1850s, and it's not as bad as poverty was in 1800. Living in poverty, but also just the raw numbers, or even as a percentage of the population, the percentage is going down, and that's a problem in that it's going in the opposite direction. In the case of the middle class is not being squeezed out. Instead, what happens is significantly the number of people who are living in the middle class is going up dramatically. People who were formerly in the poor class are rising to the middle class. and even what counts as middle class, that's a rising standard of living as the decades go on as well. And then when we start to look at the numbers of people who are rich by whatever standard of rich we want to use, we find also that the number of rich people in England, in France, in parts of Germany, and certainly in the United States and so forth, that is also going up, and again, it's going up dramatically. Now this then is problematic, because if we take Marxism as a realist account, right, of the way the world works, as a scientific account of the way the world works, and we're willing to put it to the empirical test based on the data, then these kinds of results are devastating for the classical Marxist model, because what we have then is three fairly definite predictions, and all three of those predictions turn out to be false. So what we have is, as the 1900s go on, the Marxists, when they're looking at how actual Western capitalist or semi-capitalist countries are working out, it seems like the model is not going in the direction, or the actual results are not going in the direction the model predicted, and that causes an intellectual crisis at least. What's wrong with the model? Why isn't history conforming to the theoretical model? Do we need to adjust the model? Did we miss something significant, right, and so forth. So what we have then is, by this part of the center, I'll just put a broad thing, we have a rethinking, right, that's going on, and here's the question is going to be, why is capitalism not developing along Marxist lines? And that's going to then take some thinking for people who are attracted to the Marxist way of thinking at this point here. Now, at the same time, if we look at the other side of the political spectrum, the Marxists are anti-capitalist, but they are also pro-socialist, and they are then inspired by the time we get into the second and third decade of the 20th century by the fact that there's a revolution in Marx's name in the Soviet Union, right? Tsarist Russia is transformed into communist Russia, and then as the decades go on, the same thing occurs in China and in other parts of Southeast Asia. There are nascent communist movements that are becoming significantly powerful as well. And so what we can then do is, while we're, as Marxists, if we're disappointed at the developments within capitalism, we can nonetheless be inspired by the developments of various socialist revolutions in other parts of the world here. Now, the problem is that by the time we get to 1950 as well, that particular way of thinking about things is also dealt some problematic blows. If we, for example, go to 1956, which is a significant year for the development of Marxism, a couple of things happened in 1956. One thing that happened was that the then premier of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev, made a semi-secret speech announcing semi-publicly that all of the allegations about the horrors of extermination and genocide in the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin were in fact true. Now, this is extraordinarily problematic, because obviously from much of this time period and so on, we had people in the Western nations, the United States and England and so forth, arguing that things were very bad in the Soviet Union economically, but also in terms of its record on human rights. There were any number of dissidents who had been killed, tortured, the existence of concentration camps of sorts in Siberia was well known, but a lot of that could be dismissed as simply Western propaganda, as capitalist propaganda, trying to besmirch the good name of communism, which from the Marxist perspective has to be a system that cares about its people as opposed to the capitalist system, which is exploitative. So to have the flagship nation, right, for communism, the Soviet Union, and to have the leader of that nation announce that that nation was guilty of crimes against humanity, exterminating tens of millions of its own people, that is a devastating blow for people who believe in the rightness and justice of the Marxist cause and so forth. Also in 1956, there was televised again on worldwide television Television is the new medium of the time, and the fact that the images could now be broadcast around the world relatively easy meant that some of the internal practices that the Soviet Union had been engaging in, there was actually visual evidence for this. It wasn't simply a matter of secondhand reports. Now, after World War II, much of Europe is partitioned between a West and an Eastern Europe. The West is open to the Allies, England, France, America, and so on. And much of Eastern Europe is behind the Iron Curtain, as it is called, and most of the Eastern European countries are then satellite nations under the control of the Soviet Union. And what happens in 1956, again, the banner year that I'm pointing out here is in Hungary. There's a great deal of unrest among workers who are finding that their economic livelihood is not that good. Students who are chafing under the oppressive heel as they feel from the Soviet Union and the domestic Communist Party. There's a certain amount of demonstration and unrest, and the response on the part of the Soviet Union was quite harshly militaristic, to go in, to send in the troops, to send in the tanks, to kill various people on the street, to round up leaders, to take them in for questioning and torture and outright killing. And the point is that a significant amount of this then is captured on television, broadcast for Western audiences, and this then seems to be a blow, right, for the claims that socialism in practice is going to be a much more humane system compared to capitalism in practice. We don't find in the capitalist nations any degree of brutality on that scale being directed against, right, its own people. So what we have then is a question is, why is socialism also then not working out the way the Marxist model predicted? Marxism argued that capitalism would be exploitative, that it would be ruthlessly devastating to the poorer class, that it would develop a certain population demographics, and it seems that capitalism is going in the exact opposite direction. The poor are not getting poorer, and the rich are getting richer, but also the middle class is getting richer, and the poor is getting richer. And while there are problems in the capitalist nations, nonetheless it seems to be progressing, right, as opposed to regressing, as Marxism would say. Socialism, on the other hand, according to classical Marxism, is to be a humane system that cares about its people, that delivers the goods and does so better than capitalism. But when we actually look at the practice in the Marxist-inspired nations, what we find is economic deprivation and brutal crushings of people's basic human rights in those nations as well. So the point then is that we now, by the time we get to 1950 or so, are about a century after the Communist Manifesto. So we have a century of actual empirical social science evidence to go on, and that evidence is adding up to a fairly devastating blow to Marxism and those who are believers in the Marxist project by the time we get to the 1950s. All right, so what does this mean then for postmodernism? One of the things I think is crucial here is to integrate the biographical dates of the leading postmodern thinkers. Postmodernism is a movement that sweeps certain parts of the humanities and the social sciences by the time we get into the third quarter of the 20th century, and then its educational implications start to be felt more significantly in the 1980s on through the 2000s and so forth. But what I want to do is now take the decade of the 1950s and argue that that's a key formative decade for many of the leading postmodern strategists. Now here the biography becomes important. If you take Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, Jean-Francois Lyotard, and I would add American postmodernist Richard Rorty, a striking fact is that by the time we get to the 1950s, all of these men are in their 20s and early 30s. That is to say, all of them were born in an interesting 7-year span from about 1926 or so to about 1931, right, or so. And what this then means is if they are born in that era, by the time we get to the 1950s, all of them are in their the key prime of their intellectual youth. That is to say, they are in graduate school, finishing up their graduate degrees, and launching themselves intellectually in their careers. And so what people think, decide, and strategize in their 20s and early 30s is absolutely crucial here. So what we have then is a group of people who we know from hindsight, right, became the leaders of the postmodern intellectual movement, born in the 1920s and early 1930s, coming of age intellectually in the 1950s. Now, all four of those individuals, Foucault, Rorty, Lyotard, Derrida, striking things that all four of them got their PhD degrees in philosophy. So they're very well informed, philosophically speaking, and they're getting their degrees at very good institutions. And so they're up to speed on the latest issues in epistemology, metaphysics, right, and so forth. All of them are well versed on the epistemological issues, the neo-pragmatic skepticism, the failures of positivism and logical positivism in the United States. And so all of them, to one degree or another, are well versed in the kind of the skeptical trends and more relativistic epistemological trends that are going on in the philosophical world. And one of the things that we do know is characteristic of postmodernism is a kind of relativized skepticism, a skepticism about meta-narratives, about our ability to achieve truth, about the power of reason to come to know an independent world. And so all four of these individuals and then others are coming to believe by the time we get to the 1950s that this is our true epistemological predicament. Now, the other thing, though, that is important here, and the point about the connection to Marxism, is that all four of those individuals and most of the other leading postmodernists are advocates of fairly far-left politics. All of them are socialists in one degree or other, and three of the four, Derrida, Lyotard, and Foucault, were Marxists. Foucault was a member of the French Communist Party in the early 1950s. Derrida did not join the Communist Party, but he hung around and published in journals that were markedly communist-friendly. Lyotard also was working with explicitly with Marxist groups. The American Richard Rorty is not a Marxist, but he's nonetheless a strong social democrat and kind of stakes out a position at the far end of the social democratic political spectrum as well. So the point then again is that we have not only four individuals who become leading strategists who are epistemologically well informed, getting their PhD degrees in philosophy from leading universities, but we also have four individuals who, as young men, are committed to strongly socialist analyses of societies, one being more social democratic, the other being much more explicitly Marxist in its orientation. So the argument then is going to be that I'm making is that the crises that are going on politically, right, in the classically Marxist model, right, of what's going to happen in the Soviet Union and the other leading countries and how things should be playing out in the United States and the leading capitalist nations, that this forms then a political crisis, and it's that politics and the crisis of a left way of thinking that's going on in the 1950s and the need for a re-strategization, going along with realization epistemologically that reason isn't going to work, there is no such thing as truth and so forth, that it's the marriage of those two, that skeptical, relativized epistemology rather, with a crisis, right, within a socialist political way of thinking that is going to give birth to postmodernism, right, as a movement. So what we should find then is over the course of the 1960s, as these leading figures establish themselves, and here I will cite the four I mentioned, Foucault, he becomes a big name by the time we get into the 1960s, late 1950s or 1960s. The same is going to be true with Derrida. He bursts onto the scene both in France and in the United States by the time we get to the mid to the late 1960s. Richard Rorty, right, in the United States becomes a big name in philosophy and social democratic thinking circles by the time we get 60s and on into the 70s. And the same is true with Jean-Francois Lyotard. He's the one who actually came up with the name postmodern. It comes from the postmodern condition, his book. The theme of being skeptical toward narratives, meta-narratives, rather, that also is a Lyotardian phrase here. So what we then have is all of these individuals establishing themselves as the leading strategists for postmodernism, how we're going to take the new epistemological themes and rework the political themes, and then this is what gets played out in education. We start to see by the time we get to the late 1970s on into the 1980s, and then for a generation still with us as we are in the early part of the 2000s now. So the next thing that I think comes out of the leading postmodern strategists in the early 1960s, late 1950s, and so forth is a broad agreement on a set of themes. One will take the important themes that we'll take from Lyotard's labeling it here, and that we'll call it number one is there are no meta-narratives, or at least no meta-narratives that are true, that are right, that can be justified. We shouldn't be trying, right, for meta-narratives. Now, the idea here of this piece of jargon is to say we tell stories, but the idea of a meta-narrative is some grand overarching story of all stories, right, that captures all of the essential truths about the world. And from the postmodern perspective, there are two things that are leading to this conclusion here. One is a generalized thing coming out of developments within philosophy, within epistemology particularly, analyses of science, of scientific method, of observation, of reason, of things coming out of linguistics, right, and so forth. The argument that most of the leading postmodernists are agreeing upon, and many in philosophy more generally by the time we get to the middle part of the 20th century, is a kind of skepticism, right, about the power of language to capture reality, about reason as a competent tool, as science as the one right, ultimate true picture of the universe, and so forth. So skepticism and relativism, or a kind of skeptical thinking and a kind of relativizing of narratives, of stories, and so forth, is something that broadly is agreed upon. Now, another thing, though, I think is important here is the crisis of Marxism, because Marxism is a grand meta-narrative. It bills itself as a true story of the way the world works, one that can ultimately explain everything. And so if we adopt the Marxist framework, ultimately the world should play out according to Marxism. But it's also a system that many people feel to be an idealistic system, and so they invest themselves totally in it. And if we then have an intellectual system that fails, and seems to have failed, and causes an intellectual crisis, and not only that, a crisis of identity for people who had invested themselves in that, then there's necessarily going to be a psychological impetus toward the idea, well, if Marxism failed and Marxism was supposed to be the big true account of the universe, there's going to then be a kind of a negative falling out that says, well, if Marxism failed, I guess any belief system is going to fail. So again, we're in the position of arguing that there are no meta-narratives and so forth. Okay, second major point here, though, is that while we're going to be skeptical about stories that claim to be overarchingly true about the nature of reality, and if we are still crushed with the failures of Marxism to play out according to its theoretical predictions, nonetheless, all four of these thinkers agree broadly that Marxism did capture rightly certain accounts of the way the world worked. And so the claim is going to be that Marxism is not necessarily literally and exactly and precisely right, but in the spirit, right, the spirit of Marxism, or that Marxism is essentially right, although we have to use this essentially language a bit ironically since we're speaking of postmodernism here, but it's essentially right about two things, and that is that we have zero-sum conflict. That is to say that there are groups or individuals engaged in conflict. There's a winner and there's a loser. The Marxist group analysis is right that it's a class-based or a group-based notion here, and that the world is generated by conflict. So we're going to retain from Marxism the idea that the world is governed by conflict, that it's conflict among the group dimensions or collectivized dimensions, and that it is a zero-sum conflict. That is to say, there is no happy ever after, win-win progressive solution to society's problems, rather. The third thing, though, that comes out, now this is where the postmodernists become then more original, and they are revising Marxism or revising an intellectual framework in the light of earlier historical developments and failures and so forth. The argument that the postmodernists are going to make is that while Marx was essentially right, the weakness of Marxism was in characterizing the groups along economic lines, or exclusively or primarily, right, along economic lines. What we're then going to do is say, as postmodernism, that not everything can be explained in terms of one dimension. That is to say, economic dimensions being made fundamental and everything else then being derivative, and we're just going to deduce or let the logical necessity work it out from that one basic necessary fundamental. That what we need to do is take the zero-sum conflict and broaden it in one respect. That is to say, it's going to be more than a one-dimensional group conflict that's going on within modern capitalist liberal democratic society, and we're not necessarily even going to give primacy to economic groups. So what we need to do then is focus more on what I'm going to call splinter groups. Okay. So rather than we see everything in terms of one monolithic Marxist framework, economic group here versus this economic group here, instead we're going to have a multi-dimensional battleground that's going on, and we're not going to give precedence to any one of those battlegrounds. That's going to be a historically contingent thing depending on the development of any given society. So what we have then is groups that are going to in part be based on economic class. That's fine. Marxists are right. The argument is to focus on that kind of a zero-sum conflict, but also that it is going to be a conflict among genders, right? That males and females, contrary to the good news modernist account, the males and females are also in zero-sum conflict with each other. So the gender wars take a certain turn with postmodernism. It's also the case that we have racial groups operative in society, and there are individuals who are finding and having their identities formed in terms of racial groups, and that the different racial groups are again in zero-sum conflict with each other. It's also the case that in society we have different ethnicities in conflict with each other. What else can we add to the list here? We can argue also that with respect to sexuality, the modern society will argue traditionally that there is one proper and approved form of sexuality, heterosexuality within the confines of marriage. And so what we have is a certain kind of sexual lifestyle dominating and in conflict with various alternative kinds of sexualities and so forth. And then also there will be an environmental version here. We can argue, as the postmoderns will, that it's the human species in conflict with all various other species, or even in conflict with the environment, right, itself. That the zero-sum conflict advancing human interests at the expense of all of the other organisms' interests is also characteristic of society. So the point then is going to be, from the postmodern perspective, that we should not privilege any one of these dimensions, right? That was one of Marxism's weaknesses, right? That it said it could explain everything in terms of economic class, and the reason why the Marxist model led to a crisis, why it did not accurately explain the development of societies in the modern world, is that it made derivative or secondary, or did not pay sufficient attention to all of the other dimensions of conflict that are operative in society, and instead privileged that one as well. So, and it also then was trying to construct a meta-narrative that said it could explain everything in terms of one of these dimensions here. Instead, there is no such thing as a necessary development. There's no necessity that any one of these dimensions of conflict is going to give precedence. Different societies can have different social constitutions and different conflict dynamics working themselves as things go along here. So what we will then find, though, as a result, though, when we're critiquing modern society, and then I'll point this in as the fourth point down here, is that what we then need to do is not so much hold out hope that socialism is going to come, or at least the Marxist version of socialism is going to come. We're still crushed to some extent by the failure of Marxism to work its way out. And to the extent that the capitalist societies still seem to be going along and in a quasi-progressive direction here, what we need to do is abandon our predictions that socialism is in the future, to realize that there probably is not ever going to be a happy ever after version of society, that these group conflicts are likely to go on along indefinitely here. Instead, what we need to do is focus our efforts critically, that is to say negatively, against contemporary society, critiquing it, making people aware of these conflicts that are going on, and undermining the modernist self-congratulatory story about making progress in any one of these areas here. So what we need to do then is focus on a critique of all dimensions of modern society. And so modern society is not simply characterized by a set of economic arrangements, it's also characterized by gender dynamics, by sexual dynamics, by political dynamics, by linguistic dynamics, by a relationship between us and other environmental species and so forth. Modern society as a multidimensional society is what we as postmodernists are going to be against in all of its manifestations, and we're focusing our efforts on critiquing those in a totalistic fashion as much as possible. But what we should find, though, is that the dimension, if we put a number of these things together here, is that we should find that the way modern society works is that it privileges some of these groups at the expense of other groups, that the way modern society actually has played out against its rhetoric of expanding liberty and equality for all, is that it's white people who are at the top of the heap, and anybody who is a non-white is then at the bottom of the heap or marginalized from the mainstreams of wealth and power. It is males who are increasingly at the top of the heap, and it is increasingly or continually females, right, who are marginalized or pushed down the hierarchy here. It is going to be people, we can say, of kind of Anglo-Saxon and Protestant backgrounds that become privileged here. So I'll just say Anglo-Saxon Protestants here, and so what we have then is non-Anglo-Saxon Protestants, that is to say anybody who's not an Anglo, not a European, so to speak, or at least a European influenced primarily by the Anglo way of thinking, the British Enlightenment and Scottish Enlightenment and so forth, and anybody who doesn't fit the dominant Christian, perhaps Protestant model here is going to be marginalized here as well. This model here also privileges a heterosexuality. Says it should be males and females in monogamous marital relationships. That's the proper and approved form of sexual behavior. What then gets marginalized is various forms of alternative sexualities, including homosexuality, right, and so forth. And what we also then will find is that we privilege ourselves. We say that we human beings are the most important. We're going to advance our interests, and what we are then doing from the environmental angle here, going to argue that all other species are merely commodities for our use. We can exterminate them, use them, enslave them, and so forth, however we want. So what we then are going to do then is to recognize, if we take point 3 about the splinter groups, is we have all of these groups operative here. For some people, obviously, their being white is more important, or their sexuality is more important, or their Protestant religion is being more important. And so it's not necessarily the case that in any given society that what's going on in the United States is exactly the same as what's going on in Germany, right, or Japan, right, and so forth. And so which of these conflicts is more prevalent in any given society at any given time? That's a historically contingent matter. But nonetheless, what we do have is, broadly speaking, these groups in various forms of coalitions are dominating these groups in various sort of coalitions. And so what we need to do do is, as postmodernists, recognize that this dynamic is in place, identify ourselves with this group here. These are the historically oppressed groups. We should see ourselves as advocating them, trying to bring them into more of a position of equality, but then at the same time being more critical of anybody who is in this groups and critical of the kinds of narratives and the kinds of accounts that give precedence to these or seem to be privileging accounts that are self-congratulatory or trying to tell good news stories about modern societies that only play up the achievements of people in these particular groups. All right, that then means that what we will be doing is making various theoretical adjustments to the Marxist models. We're retaining the zero-sum issue, we're retaining the conflict model, the power struggle issues, we're retaining the group analyses. We are, however, broadening it. We're not claiming that there's going to be one story that fits all societies in terms of all of their developments. We're going to have to adapt the rhetorical battle depending on the society that we find ourselves in. We're looking at smaller subdivisions of the human species, and we are abandoning the idealism that came along with Marxism and going to be devoting ourselves to what we take to be critiquing the negative elements of the modernist project, and hopefully through that critique paving the way for a postmodern kind of future. All right, so what I want to do now is summarize all of this historical story that I've been telling into a set of philosophical themes, about a half a dozen core themes that postmodernism will advance that form kind of the narrative background of its philosophical approach here. And so I have a table over to the left side of the board here that will have a more comprehensive opposition between the modern framework and the postmodern framework here. All right, modernism, if we boil it down to a half a dozen themes here or so, particularly from the postmodern perspective, believes in this set of issues here. The moderns believe that there are such things as objective truths, and it's possible for us to acquire those objective truths through observation, reasoning, and then in the more difficult cases, particularly a fully sophisticated scientific method, but we can arrive at objective truths about the world. That human reason is universal. Everybody has this capacity, and we're all living in the same world. So ultimately, through a process of discovery and then social debate and discussion and publication, we should all be able to agree upon a set of universal truths about the way the world works, including moral truths and political truths about human rights and so forth. The moderns are emphasizing individualism, that individuals have their own lives to live, their own pursuit of happiness, and that then leads to a number of things that we should be concerned with: the liberty of the individual, and so progressive emancipation of all of the human population is an important modernist goal. A belief that justice is an objectively definable universal principle, and that we should socially be able to enact a legal system and a political system that leads to justice, and an emphasis on equality, particularly against the feudal structure that divided people up into groups and classes and castes based on sexuality or religion or some other dimension. So taking seriously those three is important from the modernist perspective. Capitalism, right, as an economic system that leaves individuals free in their economic system, that leaves individuals able to run their own lives economically, to control their own property. That is the dominant economic system of the modern world. And then also progress as an ideal, the belief that it is possible optimistically for us, by taking seriously observation, reason, individualism, institutionalizing all of these socially, we can solve all of the world's problems over the course of times, and humans can progress and achieve happiness in their lives. Now, if these are the characteristic themes of the modern narrative from the postmodern perspective, all of them are false, unrealizable, or maybe even it's not correct to call them false, just to say that the claims to all of them cannot be justifiable. It doesn't make any sense. Instead, the postmoderns are more likely to argue that what we take to be truth is a kind of subjective projection right on the world, more likely to be a socially subjective projection here. that rather than there being one universal set of truths that are ultimately, all truths are partial and they're not even properly speaking truths. And so we should look at all claims as being relative claims relative to the group, or at least the leading figures within the group that are making those kinds of claims. Individuals are not the operative unit here. Individuals are molded and constructed by their cultural heritage, their linguistic backgrounds, and so forth. And so what we should have here is various kinds of group orientations or kinds of collectivism as our operating framing when we're talking about human beings. We don't believe in liberty, justice, and equality. Instead, the truth about the world is that the world is governed by power. It's not a matter of justice, it's a matter of conflict, and it's always going to be the case, or likely always, that inequality, power is going to be unevenly distributed, and then in the conflict will enable the strong to advance at the expense of the weak, perpetuating the inequalities and so forth. Postmoderns are, to a man or woman, hostile to capitalism as a system. Most of them, at least when young, came to believe in a kind of socialism as the proper kind of system. But there's a kind of chastening that has come along here, and so I will say here that there still is a commitment to a kind of socialism, right, or at least the spirit of socialism, but the way that it works in postmodernism is that most postmodernists don't believe that socialism is going to happen, that it's a historical necessity. Instead, the language I'll use here is Kantian language, that socialism functions as a kind of regulative ideal. That is to say, it's not something that is empirically real or something that we can argue has to be a historical necessity or that it's factually correct, but nonetheless it functions in our thinking as a set of principles that regulate our thinking, and the egalitarianism and so on are ideals that we as postmoderns think should be brought about. And then finally, against the progress belief and the sunny skies, unlimited optimism that is characteristic of the modern world, what we find in postmodernism as a partly intellectual attitude, but certainly as an emotional attitude as well, is a fairly strong tendency toward pessimism, tending toward a cynicism. Obviously, the modern world, the argument will be, tells lots of good news stories about itself. It prides itself on certain accomplishments, liberty, right, and equality, and so on. The postmodern perspective is likely to be that what we should do is see all such stories as partial rhetorical devices that groups use in the ongoing power struggle to position themselves and to advance their group at the interests of other people. And so what our job should be as postmodern thinkers, as critical thinkers, is to be suspicious about the cover story and to tear it off, to realize it as a mask, as a rhetorical device, and always look for the underlying reality or social reality of the situation. When we do, we're more likely to find all of the time a darker story about power conflicts, about groups using any tools, including rhetorical tools and philosophical tools, to advance their interests at the expense of other groups. So that is a more characteristic intellectual and emotional center of gravity than for postmodernism. All right, what I will do next is turn to postmodernism and education more directly and look at some of the postmodern educational theorists and then how that will play out in terms of educational practice. All right, I want to turn to postmodernism in education and connect the more theoretical, philosophical, historical material on postmodernism with the postmodern educators' notion about how practice should go. I want to read some quotations with some interspersed commentary from Henry Giroux, who in the American context is one of the leading postmodern theorists, connecting the abstract themes of postmodernism with concrete educational practice. Now, Giroux draws a great deal on Paolo Freire, another leading postmodern theorist, but for the American context, Giroux's language is more accessible as a postmodern writer than some of the other postmodern educational theorists. So from an essay entitled Border Pedagogy as Postmodern Resistance, and here's the first quotation. Giroux, well-informed, situating postmodernism as an intellectual movement against all of the other mainstream philosophical movements in the language of this course in philosophy of education, idealism or a more religion-friendly movement, or realism or a more modern and scientific-friendly movement. Giroux is positioning postmodernism against both of them in the following quotation here. Quote, "Postmodernism radicalizes the emancipatory possibilities of teaching and learning as a part of a wider struggle for democratic public life and critical citizenship. It does this by refusing forms of knowledge and pedagogy wrapped in the legitimizing discourse of the sacred and the priestly." Pause right there. That is to say, we're going to reject idealistic or religion-friendly, sacred and priestly forms of philosophical legitimation rather for our practices. Picking up the quotation again, it's rejecting universal reason as a foundation for human affairs. Interspersing again here, universal reason being the realist or modern scientific framework. As postmodernists, we're going to reject the universal reason claim. Picking up the quotation again, claiming that all narratives are partial and performing a critical reading on all scientific, cultural, and social texts as historical and political constructions. All right, translating that language a little bit, all stories, scientific stories, cultural stories, and so forth, are social constructions by the social group within which they are generated. Our job as postmodernists, is to be critical, right, of them, to diffuse the rhetorical masks, to look for the deeper story, right, and so forth. And then we have the claim also about narratives being partial. There is no such thing as a full, whole, complete story. And so on. Okay, next quotation from Giroux. Criticizing the modern world and its framework, despite all of its rhetoric about being inclusive and extending liberty and equality for all, the argument here is that that it takes all of the groups that are not white, not male, not kind of paradigmatically Anglo-Saxon Protestants and so forth, relegating them to an alien other group and then subordinating them. Right? So what we now will have is a claim about what the modern world does to those other groups. Quote, "Within the discourse of modernity, the other, capitalized O, other, not only sometimes ceases to be a historical agent, but is often defined within totalizing and universalistic theories that create a transcendental, rational, white, male, Eurocentric subject that occupies the centers of power while simultaneously appearing to exist outside of space and time." Pausing on the quotation here, what we then have is, from the modern perspective, modern philosophy, modern intellectual constructs are all about taking the white, male, Eurocentric type of life, right, the type of being, and making that the one universal right way of being, and therefore subordinating all non-white, male, Eurocentric ways of being. Picking up the quotation again, read against this Eurocentric, transcendental subject, the other is shown to lack any redeeming community traditions, collective voice, or historic weight, and is reduced to the imagery of the colonizer, unquote. Next quotation will be in postmodern analysis of modern education, modern cultural life. What it tries to do is make everybody who isn't white into a white person, everybody who isn't male into a male person, everybody who's not heterosexual into a heterosexual. It tries to take all of these different groups and assimilate them to the dominant white male Eurocentric heterosexual model. And so what modern education does is cause people who are not fitting into that model to give up their identity. Quote, "Moreover, students who have to disavow their own racial heritage in order to succeed are being positioned to accept subject positions that are the source of power for a white dominant culture." That quotation focuses on racial issues, but the argument here is that whites hold all of the power, and they force people who aren't white to give up their own racial identities and to act white or to internalize white ways of thinking if they're going to succeed in the white kind of world. Next quotation. Then what the postmodern educator then has to do is oppose that tendency of modernism to try to assimilate everybody to the white male way of thinking. Quote, "For those designated as others need to both reclaim and remake their own histories, voices, and visions as part of a wider struggle to change those material and social relations that deny radical pluralism." Unquote. So the truth about the world is that there are all of these different groups that are incommensurate with each other. There is no one right way of group being. We should not try to be assimilating. Instead, what we should be doing is affirming all of the different group identities, and as educators, helping students to reclaim, to re-identify themselves with their own groups, their own racial groups, their own ethnic groups, their own gender groups, their own sexuality groups, and so forth, and encourage their development as members of those groups to which they properly belong. And what this then means also is not only as educators to focus on how to relate to students, but also we first will need to attend to teachers, the teachers who are going to be teaching the students. We need to remake the teachers who are coming into the education program, particularly teachers who by the time they get to us as professors of education, who have already been raised in modern society and assimilated and taught explicitly or even implicitly, and who have probably internalized the notion of the white male Anglo-Saxon Protestant as the proper way of being. We need to focus on teacher re-education as well. Quote, "This suggests that to the degree that teachers make the construction of their own voices, histories, and ideologies problematic, they become more attentive to otherness as a deeply political and pedagogical issue." So most of the teachers in contemporary society are white. Most of them come from Anglo-Saxon background. Most of them have been conditioned to think in terms of liberal capitalism, modern society, right, and so forth. What we need to do then is to teach them that that way of thinking, their way of thinking, is problematic, right? Not to take it for granted, not to think of themselves as training people to be cogs in the modern capitalist machine, to become self-reflectively critical of their own upbringing, of their own identities. To the extent that they do so, that will then put them in a position as teachers to be more sensitive to other groups and other ways of thinking about it, non-white ways of thinking about things, human-centered ways of thinking about things, non-heterosexual ways of thinking about things, and so on. All right, so the first thing we need to do then as postmodern intellectuals who are concerned with education is to transform the teachers. The teachers are going to then be the field workers, right, the cultural workers who are then going to go forth into the schools and then do the job of culturally transforming the next generation of students. I have a contemporary example. As it happens, we're shooting this in the semester break between the 2009-2010 academic year. And one of the national debates in education focuses on the University of Minnesota, where the School of Education there apparently has a fairly strong contingent of postmodernists who are putting forth a proposal that will require all future teachers who are going to be certified by the University of Minnesota and therefore get their license to teach in the state of Minnesota, in effect sign on to a postmodern intellectual framework here. The University of Minnesota's Twin Cities is the campus in question here, empowered a race, culture, class, and gender task group in the University's College of Education and Human Development, and this report that is then put forth to the university argues that teacher candidates essentially must argue that the modernist project, the language used here is, quote, the American dream, with all of the elements of that package, must be rejected if a student is going to be recommended for licensure, the licensure required by the Minnesota Board of Teaching. The The document also speaks of the, quote, myth of meritocracy, right, in the United States. Of course, that's the modern story, the idea that if we free individuals up, treat people as individuals, eliminate legal obstacles, then anybody with encouragement and freedom can achieve his or her own dream, achieve happiness, and that America is the land of opportunity, open to people of all races, creeds, sexes, and so forth. That all of that, of course, is a myth, that it's a self-perpetuating myth for the powers that be in the United States. This will also require that teachers take a self-critical attitude toward their own cultural heritage, particularly if their cultural heritage is to be mainstream people, white people, nice middle-class people raised in the United States. Quote, recommending language is the following, quote, as an Anglo teacher, I struggle to quiet voices from my own farm family, echoing, as always, some unstated standard. How can we entangle our own deeply entrenched assumptions, right, unquote. So part of teacher training then, particularly teacher training for Anglo teachers, will be for postmodern teacher training to focus on critiquing the unstated assumptions or the ways in which we as Anglos have been molded by our background, and then hopefully being able to take a distanced, critical perspective on those assumptions. That also part then of teacher training will then be for teachers to demonstrate that they have the proper compassion, understanding for all of the other groups, students who are members of the various other groups that they're going to teach. The document goes on to say that, quote, teachers must show that they understand many groups that are typically not included, right, within America's celebrated cultural identity, and that such exclusion is frequently a result of dissimilarities in power and influence, unquote. So student teachers then have to be aware that there are all of these other groups out there that are excluded from the centers of power, and that the centers of power want to keep them excluded. And so what our job then is to be sensitive to the plight of all those other groups and to recognize that they're being marginalized and excluded by those centers of power. In particular, aspiring teachers have to be able to, quote, explain how institutional racism works in schools, unquote. Again, it may not seem that American society has institutionalized racism. It might seem that most of the administrators, most of the teachers are not racist, that they're not teaching in racist fashions. But nonetheless, a postmodern person is going to be able to recognize that this is just a cover story, that if you strip off the good news mask that the institutions will tell, you will find that deeply institutionalized racism is in fact the reality of the way teachers think and teach, the way administrators think and administer, the way social dynamics work out in communities and so forth. Also, we will have to show that teachers are able to recognize, quote, the history of demands for assimilation to white, middle class, Christian meanings and values, and the history of white racism with special focus on the current colorblind ideology, unquote. So part of then teacher training will be to teach all of that the way this culture works, and particularly the way schools of education typically have worked, is that they have this colorblind ideology. We have to rip off the mask of that colorblind ideology to understand that really what's going on is we're trying to assimilate the next generation of teachers to teaching white, middle-class Christian values so that they will then go on and teach the next generation to assimilate. That's what we have to overcome, and the first step is going to be for us as professors of education to train the next generation of teachers to recognize that that's not what they should be doing, and to make them sensitive to that particular fact. All right, I want then to turn to three elements of the curriculum. I've mentioned here teacher training and how postmoderns will recast teacher training. Well, suppose we have the appropriate kinds of teachers trained and we send them forth into the school. How will they then focus? Well, there will be lots of issues and an ongoing multidimensional curricular battle, methodological battle, and so forth that goes on. I want here just to focus on three of the contemporary battlegrounds where postmodernism has had a fairly high high profile in transforming the curriculum, or at least establishing for itself a place in the curriculum. One of the areas is the area of literature and reading. The postmoderns will argue that if we look at what is called the canon, or the Western canon of literature, and we say what we should be doing as educators, and this is the modern story, is they're exposing our students to the best of the historical literature, what we should have students be aware of, and a classically and a contemporarily educated person will be familiar with Homer, with Aristotle, with Cicero, with Chaucer, Shakespeare, Herman Melville, and so forth. What the postmoderns will argue is that canon, right, of great books, that canon of great of classic literature, is exclusively written by males. It's exclusively written by white people. It's exclusively written by people who are Eurocentric or heavily influenced by the Eurocentric. And so what we're doing here is not really privileging works that are in fact objectively and universally great, but rather we are privileging a set of literary texts that white male Europeans think are good texts. And so what we're therefore doing is explicitly excluding all other texts that are female texts, that are non-white texts, that are coming from different racial, ethnic, and religious backgrounds. And so what we should be doing is deconstructing, right, the Eurocentric texts in the canon to show that they have flaws, that are weaknesses, or that they are used to prop up a certain way of thinking, but rather what we should be also doing is, aside from setting aside those particular texts and deconstructing them, making sure that we have equal representation of books that are not written by white people, not written by males, not written by people who are Christian, and so forth. And so what we should be doing is pushing for, if not necessarily an explicit affirmative action quota system for literature, nonetheless taking a critical stance to the canon of white male Eurocentric texts and arguing for more representation of non-white, non-male, and so forth texts in the literature. So the so-called literature wars that have been fought over the course of the last century in large part have been given impetus by a postmodern text. History is another major battleground here. The postmoderns argue that there is no such thing as objective history. There is no such thing as impartial history. There is no such thing as one history that should be taught to all students universally. There are a number of groups out there, each with their own histories, and so rather than saying here's one history curriculum, we should have multiple historical curricula, and what we should do is have one curricula for white students, one curricula for black students, one history that is appropriate for male students, one history curricula that plays up the achievement of female students, not a history that is self-congratulatory for Christians, but rather a curriculum that makes room for Islam and all of the other religions as well. Also, the postmoderns will argue that we should be aware that history is a rhetorical tool. History is always written by the winners, and the winners always play up their side of the story and demonize the side that lost the story. And of course, the way it has worked out historically from the postmodern perspective is that whites have won, Europeans have won, males typically win all of these battles, and so what we have in history is a rhetorical story that plays up the achievement of white European males. And so what we should be doing is being critical, be willing to expose those white European males as having a seamy underbelly to play up their historical sins, and then at the same time to be willing to look at the groups that they have been beating up upon historically and to play up the achievements of those groups, or at least to try to engender in our students sympathy for the groups that have been beat up in history. So for example, if we talk about the European settlement of North America, the typical story, the argument will be, is that the Europeans are bringing enlightenment, they're bringing democracy, they're bringing science, they're bringing universal human rights and so forth to the benefit of not only themselves, of course, but of the Native Americans and so forth, that they took an essentially empty society and built civilization up from nothing. Instead, what we should be doing from the from the postmodern perspective is arguing that the Europeans brought with them imperialism, they brought with them racism, they brought with them disease, they brought with them an intolerant religion, they brought with them a willingness to use the power of government to commit genocide on the native populations. And what we should be doing then is, when we're telling the stories of the natives, to play up the fact that the natives were peaceful, that they were more likely to be living in harmony with nature rather than exploiting nature, that they were more live and let live and wanting to live in peace with the Europeans as well. So what we should be doing is remaking the discipline of history in a much more group egalitarian fashion, and stripping away the pretenses of the progressive optimistic story that has dominated the teaching of history for the last century or two. Third, science. The teaching of science has also come under criticism from the postmodern perspective. Again, the scientific way of thinking, the argument here is that science is based on observation. From the modern perspective, it's based on reason from the modern perspective. And so since observation should be universal to the species, and reasoning and the capacity for doing scientific analysis and so forth should be universal to the species, the modernist way of thinking about science is that science then is universalistic. The truths that science comes up with should be believed by all people, and so we should have one scientific set of truths, or one scientific curriculum, one scientific set of content and method that all students should learn and all students should become proficient at. What the postmoderns are more likely to argue is that science is just one way of thinking about the world. Scientific reasoning, scientific analysis is one way, of course, of telling a story about the world, but it's one that perhaps is more amenable to a male way of thinking, to a white European way of thinking, and that we should not be exclusionary and be dismissive of the ideas that there might be a more female way of thinking, or a more non-white way of thinking, or non-European histories or traditions of thinking about the world that are more empathetic, that are more emotionalist, that are more socially constructed, that are more magical, and so forth. And so we should be sensitive and open to other kinds of stories. This kind of battle will come to the fore when we look at test scores, for example. Various kinds of standardized tests will be given, and we might, for example, notice that males typically score better on science and math and logic and quantitative portions of the test than females do. Or we might notice that white students and Asian students do better on science and math than Hispanic students and black students are doing on the test. How do we then interpret these results? Well, we can, of course, then say that, well, this just shows that we need to be working more with girls to increase their math proficiency, or we need to be working more with Hispanic students to increase their science proficiencies. But the assumption there, of course, is that all groups, no matter what their background, should learn one way of thinking about things, and we should be totalizing and universalizing and forcing them to fit the model. What we're more likely to find from the postmodern way of thinking is an argument that we should not be expecting all groups, given their histories and their different identities, to be performing equally well on science, on math, on quantitative kinds of disciplines, and that it is unjust and oppressive to be forcing them to be trying to do so. It might also be the case that we will make the argument that such tests, by privileging rather a white way of thinking, or a male way of thinking, or a European way of thinking, are biased, and that by demanding that all of the non-whites and all of the non-males accept those as their standards, then what we're doing is setting them up for failure, because they're not going to be able to meet those standards, and so we're then just going to be setting them up for accepting a secondary or a marginalized position in society. If, after all, that's not the right way of thinking for them, if it requires an alien way of thinking, they're never going to be proficient at it, then by the time we get through the school system, their grades are going to be subpar, and that means we're setting them up only for subpar positions in society, which means we're excluding them from access to the avenues of power and so forth. So science as a way of thinking is something that is a limited way of thinking, it's a biased way of thinking, and what we should then be doing is marginalizing science and making making room rather in the curriculum for other ways of thinking and institutionalizing those to give all groups equal power. Now, this then is not to say that there is another group's way of thinking that is the right way. The postmodern project is overall to say there is no such thing as a right answer. There is no such thing as a right way. There is no such thing as a happily ever after story that we can tell about society. Society is a multidimensional group conflict, ongoing power struggle between the strong and the weak along a variety of dimensions. What we as postmodern educators need to do is recognize the power struggle for what it is, empower ourselves to be able to enter into that ongoing rhetorical battle. From the postmodern perspective, we should take our cue from identifying with the groups that have historically been oppressed, identifying with them and bringing them to a position more of equality or of a position of being able to realize their own cultural aspirations in society and to lessen the death grip or the power hold that certain groups have had traditionally on existing society.